So it brings us on to tonight's presentation, and it gives me a great pleasure, having, to be honest with you, purchased your book myself. In fact, I think I've done previous editions as well, to welcome along Joe Brown, compiling and creating a London Railway Atlas. Joe.
Okay, no, I'll just check it on the lights. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So this is a little presentation that I have knocked together all about the London Railway Atlas and some of the other things that I've worked on. I've not ever given a talk like this before, so please be gentle. That's all I'll ask. So this story starts in 1977, best known for the Silver Jubilee, of course. And incidentally, small fact, I work on the Jubilee line today. I know. So there were some important births in 1977. The first one is this, which is the Rail Atlas of Britain by Stuart Baker. Here's my copy. It's actually signed by Mr. Baker himself. And I'm actually very, very flattered that I've been asked by Cressy to edit it as Mr. Baker's unfortunately in quite ill health currently. So I've been asked to edit some of the areas of the country that I should hopefully know something about. London being one, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, but I shall move on to all of that later. So another important birth in 1977, bit of a mouthful, but this is C.R. Clinker's Register of Closed Passenger Stations and Goods Depots in England, Scotland and Wales, 1830 to 1977. Like I say, quite a mouthful, but there's no doubt what lies inside this book. This is probably one of my main reference sources. It's basically got all of the dates of station closures, but of particular interest to me is the good station closure dates, which are quite hard to find. So like I say, this is pretty much my Bible in terms of dates. And finally, probably the most important 1977 birth is mine. So I thought I'd do a small link there between two of the books which I think have been very important to the development of my books and me. I'm going to digress very slightly here. Does anyone recognise the guy on the left? Edward Watkin, did I hear? There you go. So it's a bit of a tenuous link, but I thought I'd share this because I like to tell people about this link. So on the left you've got Sir Edward Watkin. He was the chairman of the Metropolitan Railway, so clearly that is quite a strong link to the Underground. He also was the person behind the Great Central Railway. He was on the chair of the South Eastern Railway, so he was very much a railway man. The slightly odd image is his aborted Channel Tunnel. He started building the Channel Tunnel in 1880. That's about as far as he got at Folkestone, a bit of a tunnel going through the chalk. And finally, also with a bit of a personal link, that's the first stage of Watkins Folly, which was intended to be taller than the Eiffel Tower, built at Wembley Park, which is where I work. That's the link. Yes, it was being built where Wembley Stadium stands today, started to sink into the marshy ground and they had to blow it up, unfortunately. So why am I telling you about Watkin? So the guy on the right, also Joseph Brown, is my great-grandfather and he was his butler. So there you go. That's my link. I just thought I'd chuck that out there for you. So I can't really say that there's much of a direct link between me and royalty in railway terms, but at least I am a descendant from someone who used to make his tea. So I did digress then, sorry. I thought I'd share that. So next up, here's what we're all here for, pictures of trains, of course. So I just want to explain a bit, and I'm sure we all have a similar story, why I ended up being fascinated by trains as a small boy. So I won't be testing you all, but these are the trains I was exposed to as a small boy. So the beautiful COCP stock, which used to run on the District Line. R stock, ditto. Class 501 on the Broad Street Line. The 4 subs on the Hounslow Loop. And lots of freight. So where I grew up, in Chiswick, I was surrounded by all of these trains, and I think from a very early age, because I actually had the district line running right past my house as a child, I was steeped in railways from a very early age. And I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but I think some of these are quite beautiful trains. So a similar kind of time, I'd asked my dad to pick up the free Journey Planner tube maps on his way home from work. So I started to develop a bit of a mental picture of London's railways. So at this stage, I started to have a bit of a love for a good map. So I would often ask my mother if I could hang around on a footbridge and wave at a train driver on the way past, hope that I'd get the horn, if you pardon the expression. And so, yeah, this is how I started to become interested in trains. So then it's a bit of a leap from being interested in trains to being interested in railway history. But how I'd like to explain it is thus. So near where I grew up, I won't be testing you, but there are a few old relics of railways that I used to see and think, that's a bit odd. I wonder where that went. I wonder what that was for. So this is Ravenscourt Park to Hammersmith, the London South Western Railway viaducts. This is Bollow Lane, this half a bridge, still there. Brentford High Street, bit of viaduct there, Great Western Railway. This is Gunnersbury Triangle, obviously one side is missing. And here is the Hammersmith and Chiswick branch, which kind of went from nowhere to nowhere, but it drives quite a striking slash through West London. So it explains why there's a bridge that essentially crosses nothing at Stamford Brook. And finally, Chiswick Village, very close to where I grew up. You've got the curve of one of the blocks, which basically follows the old Chiswick curve. So my interest started to be piqued by all of these relics that I would see. And so I started turning my sights to the A to Z to try and follow these lines and work out where they went. Similar time, I started to plan my own tube maps. So quite a few A to Zs bit the dust, covered in lots of marker pen. But there you go, I obviously didn't have many friends. So around about the age of 12, the first incarnation of the London Railway Atlas started, and it was very crude. Basically, it was the A to Z, tracing paper, pens and tape. And so I essentially started to trace London's railways, and as I added more and more, various sheets of A4 paper were being stuck to each other, until it turned into this massive beast that took up the best part of a bedroom wall. So this prompted me to go to the local library and start to do research into railway history, try to work out the closed lines, the closed stations. And so this is essentially how I did it. And that must have been when I was around about 12, give or take. Then unfortunately, as happens to many of us, or all of us, teenage years happened. It was no longer cool to have a big map of railways above my bed. The tape started to yellow, and very unfortunately, this ended up in the bin. So there is no record of it. I have looked at my dad's house, and it definitely was binned. So that's quite a sad tale. So you might think at this stage I'd take off the mic and go, sorry, talk's over. That was my entire railway atlas history gone. However, this happened. So in 1997, I joined the Underground. There's me modelling the late 90s Underground uniform. So I started as a guard at East Finchley on the Northern Line. I was recruited as one of the last ever guards, they told me, but they were telling people that for a few years after that. So this was my office, the back of a 59 stock, sometimes a 62 stock, because there are a few trains recycled from the Central Line. The following year, 98, I went up to the school to do what we used to call motors. So I learnt how to be a driver at the age of 20, which is quite scary. So that was my office, a 59 stock in Highgate Wood Depot. I didn't particularly like the Northern Line. It was very dusty, dirty, lots of tunnel. It never ran on time. So I decided that I wanted a change of scene. So I put in a transfer to go to the District Line to Parsons Green. It's where I first met Colin Smith at the back. Hello, Colin. And so I was a lot happier there, basically. District Line was a much nicer place to work. After a couple of years as a driver at Parsons Green, Duty manager trains, DMT, the advert came out, so I put in for that, was able to get it at Earls Court. So we basically used to run half the district line service from a cupboard under the stairs on platform 3 at Earls Court. So there's me and some of my colleagues. And then after 8 in total very happy years at Parsons Green Earls Court, I put in for a job called Train Operations Manager, or TOM. Here's me looking a little bit chubby on the Bakerloo line. So I was at the Elephant and Castle depot for a couple of years, had a year on stations, and then I went back to Train Operations Manager. And that is at Wembley Park Depot, where I've been for the past 8 years. So I'm currently based, as I said, on the Jubilee line. So I'm sorry that was nothing to do with the Atlas, but I thought, we're all friends here. Many of us are ex-LU staff or current LU staff, so I just thought I'd share that story. So on to business. So that's all well and good. I thought I'd share that with you. I hope you don't mind. But I need to explain how, from working on the Underground, I started to draw railway maps again. I will explain what this is, don't worry. So a couple of conversations I think were important in me starting to do the London Railway Atlas. So the first one was with a friend, Frank. We were going down to Cornwall by train, and we both divulged the fact that we had a bit of an interest in closed railways, closed stations, and I said, I had a big map on my wall when I was about 12, and we both agreed, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could go out and buy an atlas of London's railway history? And as soon as I got home, tried to find one, and I couldn't. I thought that was a bit odd, but there you go. So that was the first kind of seed that was sown. And then the second one, and that's what this map is, a colleague at work who always does late shifts, so he's often potentially connecting with the last trains as he goes from one end of the line to the other. We're saying it's very confusing. He doesn't know when he gets to embankment whether the last Bakerloo's already gone, whether it hasn't, whether he's meant to make a PA to the customers, etc., etc., etc. So he said, wouldn't it be great if there was a map that told all district line drivers when the last trains were? So I thought, yeah, that's a really good idea. I'd like to try my hand at doing that. So I didn't know how to do it. I only purchased my first PC in 2001. And I was actually a member of an internet forum called Skyscraper City, which actually I don't know if any of you are members of it, but it's got quite a big transport section too. And in essence, I went on there to ask people who are architects and town planners if they knew which software would be good to draw a map. And someone came back and they said Office Visio. So that's basically what this is drawn on. I guess it's probably a little bit hard to see, but this is in diagram format, the entire district line, and it shows every line that it intersects with, and you probably can't see it, but you've got the times of the last trains Monday to Saturday in blue and Sunday in red. So I thought this was quite a good map. I was quite proud of it. I thought it was quite neat. And I started to enjoy drawing maps again. So this is kind of where it all started, basically, was off the cuff saying, I quite fancy doing this map, and I did. I tried to tout it around to the management of the district line at the time, and no one really seemed to care, which is their loss. I'm not bitter. So after that last trains map, I had itchy fingers, a lot of time on my hands, clearly, and I harked back to the conversation I had with my friend Frank 4 years before about, wouldn't it be wonderful if someone did an atlas of London's railway history? So I thought, I know, I can do that. So I started to have a little play. Harking back to when I was a child, I used the A to Z, so the Humble London A to Z, as my guide. And you can see this is a sample of one of the very first pages of the very first version. And it's a bit difficult to tell, but it is one of the A to Z pages. So I started to have a play, and I thought, yeah, I can do this. Started to work on it as a bit of a hobby. As you can see, it's very crude. The program Visio has a metro map drawing set of templates, so you have very kind of basic symbols for stations, no platforms shown, no real track detail. The basics were a thick line for double track and a thin line for single, using the underground tube colours and orange for Network Rail before the overground was invented. So quite early on, I had a bit of a change of heart, because if you look at the average A to Z page, a lot of the pages in outer London, in terms of railways, are actually quite sparse. So there isn't an awful lot going on. It would have been quite a boring atlas page. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to go for 2 scales here. So around outer London, I combined 4 A to Z pages into a single page, and then inner London remained as the single pages. So I'd done a bit of work, prepared some sample pages, thought, yeah, this is going well. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could get this published? So I never started out thinking that's what I would do, but I thought after a certain stage of refining what I was doing, I thought I may as well. So I wrote a very polite letter to Ian Allen and said, these are some sample pages, would you like to publish my book? And I was staggered that they immediately wrote back and said, yes. I thought, oh, that was easy. I guess other people don't find the publishing game quite so easy, but I guess it's fair to say this is very niche. So there weren't many publishers that I would have thought to have approached, probably only 2. The first one I asked said yes, so that was nice. This is the letter. Not that you can read it. But during that process, I thought, no, I don't really like this format because you've got 2 different scales, and if you want to follow the progress of a line, if you want to turn from one page to the next, you don't want to then be jumping to the back of the book to, I always get these the wrong way around, back of the book to the large scale. From the small scale at the front. So quite early on, and before it was published, I decided that I was going to apply the same scale to the entire map. So it's the same principle. Every single map, and even now, of the London Railway Atlas is simply 4 A to Z pages. And I much preferred this because, like I say, you could follow the course of a particular line by turning the pages rather than having to jump from the front to the back. So I approached the publisher and I said, look, do you mind, I've changed it massively? And they were like, yeah, that's fine. And I actually made it quite a bit smaller, which I guess is cheaper for them to produce. So on the 24th of February 2006, this happened. The first edition of the London Railway Atlas was published. So you can see this is the final format. Again, sorry for those at the back, probably quite hard to see. But it's very simple, using the LU line colours, orange for main line, but you can see stations are simple blobs. You can just about make out, so this is the Hammersmith and Chiswick branch that I pointed out before. You can just about make out there's a faint line there. So I was making a distinction between lines that were open and lines that were closed on the basis of whether they were heavy or faint. But other than that, hopefully fairly straightforward. A very lurid shade of green for the district line, bizarrely. But that was basically it. So to be a published author, in inverted commas, by the age of 30 was great. Very proud of that. I do use the word author quite loosely. There were some principles that I used which are still in force today. So anything with black text is open, red text is closed. I'm not even going to point because you won't be able to see it, but anything in italic refers to non-passenger, so depots, goods yards, etc. And so those principles are still in force today. One other thing, probably quite hard to see, but I had blocks of text which would explain bits of history. For some reason I was quite wedded to capitals, so a reader wrote in and said I looked like I was always shouting. So I no sooner had the first edition come out, itchy fingers again, clearly too much time on my hands. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful? And I did get a bit of feedback from people also, but rather than just having this very kind of simple format, why don't I try and map every single track? So every single crossover, sidings, etc., etc. And therefore it follows I'd also be mapping every single platform. So I set about essentially completely redrawing the map from scratch, which I did. And then, what was the date? 2nd of July 2009, the second edition came out. The other big difference, aside from the changes to format, again, this probably looks exactly like the previous one, but trust me, it is different. Every single track was mapped, so you could see all of the detail, platforms separate rather than just a simple blob for stations. And because of the increase in detail, it then became an A4 book. The first edition was more like between A5 and A4. And off the back of that, harking back to what was on my bedroom wall, I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a fold-out version? So I produced this, and I was quite proud of this. I genuinely thought it looked really good, and I'd have happily had it on my wall. I said to Ian Allen, would you like to publish this? And they weren't really interested, so that's a shame. Again, their loss. If you zoom in, again, I think it's a little bit fuzzy, but you can see it's something which is quite pleasing to the eye. I think there's something quite nice about not having the separate pages and having it all laid out in a single sheet. But anyway, it wasn't to be. But then I bought a copy of Modern Railways a few years later, and I opened to the middle, and lo and behold, there was a fold-out version of the Atlas in there. So someone had obviously had the same idea as me. But I took it, I was quite flattered, clearly. I took it as a good PR stunt. Hopefully they sold a few books off the back of it. So, where are we? Yes, so I decided after looking at this format that, and it's probably very difficult for anyone to see, but I was starting to be a little bit irked because when I originally drew the Atlas, I very, very simply did it by eye. So I was looking at a page of the A to Z in one hand and with the mouse drawing it on the PC with the other. So it started to irk me that some of the lines were not quite where they should be and there was some distortions. So I decided to make a rod for my own back and rework the entire Atlas again. So what I decided to do, it's a very crude and simple method, but it's something which I still use to this day. I'll start off with a canvas. So the canvas is essentially going on Google Maps and you have to zoom in quite far to get the right level of detail and just taking screenshots after screenshots after screenshots, going into Photoshop, and then I'd knit it all into a single very, very large file. And so this is like basically the canvas that I work on, and I've used the same format for the Birmingham and the Liverpool and Manchester atlases since, which I will go on to later. You'll be pleased to hear. So on the top, I drop the page boundaries, hopefully just saw a grid appear. And so it was a bit of work actually. I didn't want to make too much work for myself, so I decided to try and get the page boundaries to marry up exactly with the ones in the the second. And so there was a bit of tinkering took place to get the page boundaries to match perfectly. Then it was a case of copying and pasting the pages onto these rectangles, and then if I did need to move things around to align themselves with how things actually were, then I would do that. So that is how the third edition started to come about. You can see here on the left you've got basically what I had to work with, so that's the kind of template, that's my screenshot, and then I would just essentially trace over the top. And it just meant that I was a lot happier in that everything was exactly where it should be, rather than something that was more crudely traced by eye. So the third edition was published on the 2nd of August 2012, which was the Olympic year, as we all know. So I wanted to make sure that the Olympic Stadium was mapped. So this is on the large scale, always getting mixed up, large scale Stratford map. And I had to make sure that Emirates Stadium was on the Finsbury Park map, because I'm an Arsenal season ticket holder, although I keep that very quiet these days. So on the subject of large-scale maps, I use the same method. So if you look on the left, here we have a stitched together 1916 Ordnance Survey map of King's Cross and St Pancras. So essentially it's a very similar principle, lots of screenshots, stitch them all together in Photoshop, and then it takes a lot of time, but just trace over the top. So once it's all traced, then I will delete the original image underneath, in case anyone from Google's here, or Ordnance Survey. Don't want to get sued. So I like to think it does give quite a pleasing effect, and yes, it certainly means that it's accurate because it's traced over Ordnance Survey. So the fourth and the fifth editions have since followed on the 26th of February 2015 and the 23rd of November 2018, respectively. But the principle's pretty much the same. It's the same coverage. They're both the same 74 pages. Each time one comes out, then obviously I'll be adding a bit more value. There'll be some new detail, corrections, refinements, new things added in. And I was very happy that the fifth edition was going to come out Christmas last year. So it was the grand opening of Crossrail. It was like Crossrail's open. It was shown as a line opening on the 9th of December 2018. And I'd sent it off to Cressy, and that's the other thing, sorry, I should have noticed, I should have said, backtrack. Between the fourth and the fifth editions, Ian Allen was bought by Cressy, so without any say in the matter, I now have Cressy as a publisher, but so far, so good. So anyway, I'd sent the final files off to Cressy around about August 2018 to say, there you go, get this out in time for Christmas. There's a lovely picture of a Crossrail train on the front. And then I think about 3 weeks later, they announced that it had been put back. So I had to get the files back and change everything. So unfortunately, the fifth edition just has a very vague 2020 question mark opening date, which is a shame. So I'm now going to move on to my reference sources. So the first one, I don't know if anyone knows this book, but this is Colonel Cobb, thank you. It cost me about 150 quid, and that was about 10 years ago. It's a veritable doorstop. It's in 2 volumes, and it weighs several kilos. I haven't weighed it, but I think probably, not far off 10. It's huge, massive. So basically, the principle of this book is the late Colonel Cobb, I believe he's late, traced over the entire country, over the top of Ordnance Survey maps, every single passenger railway that has ever been and every single station. So this is my starting point. This gives me the overview of railways, which railway companies owned them, the locations of stations, the locations of all of the former stations. So this basically my first, if I am starting a railway atlas from scratch, as I've had to do 3 times now, the first pass is using Colonel Cobb just to plot where all of the lines are and where all of the stations are. Next up, I want to refine it, so I want to get the detail. So this is where I depend on the Quail track maps. I think there's 5 in total. Very, very, very useful. These basically use the Network Rail appendix. So Network Rail produce online a book which has pretty much up-to-date detail of all of the railways in the entire country. It's very difficult to navigate and very difficult to use. So I tend to depend on Quail, which is essentially using all of the same data, but in a much more user-friendly format. I do then have to refine things, so that's just a screenshot of Google Earth. Because quite often railways might technically be open, but they might not have seen a train for 20 years. So I'll go onto Google Earth, and if it's a jungle, if I can't even see the rails, or if metal thieves have stolen the rails, then I'm not going to show that as an open line. Although technically, according to Network Rail, the line is still open, just in a mothballed state. The next part of the process is mapping, and this is like the really fun bit, all of the historic lines, of which there are many. So this is a bit hard to see, but this is something called oldmaps.co.uk. It's a very good program. It's free. You can drop a pin in the map anywhere in the country, and you can go back and forward in time to any number of Ordnance Survey maps. Anything of a scale 1 to 2,500 or larger, you'll get all of the track detail. So I spend an awful lot of my life in oldmaps.co.uk. The National Library of Scotland does a very similar website, but it doesn't quite have the same range of dates, so I tend to depend on this. Next up, I need the detail of the stations. So the 2 books that I depend on, I've already mentioned Clinker, but the one that I use for the passenger stations is Quick, which is the railway passenger stations in Great Britain. Really, really good book. Again, it's a bit of a doorstop, not quite as expensive or large as Cobb, but it, in essence, gives you the full history of every passenger station in the entire country. So every name change, the dates of the name change, when it opened, when it closed on a temporary basis, when it reopened, etc., etc. So without these, I wouldn't know where I'd be. And finally, special mention to Borley. So this is the chronology of London's railways. It came out in the early 80s, I think. And this, in terms of London railway history research, is the absolute pinnacle. It's been very, very useful. And a couple of these books, Clinker and Borley, were actually genuinely really hard to find. Quite a long online search to track down a second-hand copy. I have a very large library of second-hand books now. Some of them you can pick up for £1 on Amazon, ex-library books, etc. Some more expensive. So I feel that I'm performing quite a useful role. So I've already mentioned that Clinker, Borley, several other books are out of print, very hard to find. So I feel what I'm doing is I'm in the digital age, I'm capturing all of this data and putting it down in a format that will hopefully be saved for many, many years to come. So I don't really profess that I'm going out to the Public Records Office or libraries and doing loads of my own research. I'm very much depending on research that other people have already done. But I do very occasionally find out new things. So I just wanted to give one example here. Again, might be quite hard to see, but this is from the 4th edition. We've got 2 stations marked, Southwark Park and Commercial Docks. and they've always been recorded as two completely separate stations, and that's how it's always been. Every reference source has always said they're two separate stations. But when I started to look at the Ordnance Survey, again, you won't be able to see this, but I noticed here where I think the platform would have been. So this is the 1875 Ordnance Survey, which was actually about 10 years after commercial dock station closed. And I could see here where the tracks splayed apart. I could see where clearly the platform was. And then if you fast forward to when Southwark Park Station was open, the area's got a lot more built up. But I established that actually the location of the two stations was exactly the same. What caused the confusion was the entrances were on two different roads. So I feel like I've been able to give back a bit in that I have finally answered a question that I'm sure has like really, really puzzled people forever. Were they two different stations or not? I've answered the question. They're not. So you can see in the 5th edition, proudly marked as a single station. And also there was an experimental service on the London and Greenwich Railway before it actually opened fully to the public. So there was yet another station, Corbett's Lane, on exactly the same site. So 3 different stations on the same site. So that's the London Railway Atlas. I just want to talk about a couple of the other titles. So the first one was, I guess, by my reckoning, a little bit of a failure. So this was the ABC version. I was approached by Ian Allen. They said, would you like to do an ABC pocket-sized version of your atlas? I was like, no, not really, but they said, no, it'd be great, do it. So I was like, okay, fine. So I had to, in many ways, revert back to the original format, which is very, very simple. It was shrunk down into a small paperback pocket-sized version. And it felt a little bit counter-intuitive, getting rid of all of the detail and taking it back to basics. So that came out in 2015. It wasn't a huge amount of work, but it didn't sell particularly well either. And I don't really blame people because they were selling it for 12 quid when the main atlas was only 20. So if I had 20 quid to spare, I know which I'd go for personally. So that was the other London title, the ABC. I now need to get a little bit deep about printing. Please bear with me. So Visio is in RGB format, and RGB, red, green, blue, is designed for TV screens, monitors, and the colour black is the absence of light. Now, you can't print the absence of light. All printing depends on CYMK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I don't know why black is K and not B, but there you go. So how the printing process works is I have to overlay a mix of the 4 colours and they all combine to give you black. And so the format of the London Railway Atlas on Visio was an RGB, and it had always caused some problems when it came to printing. They had to try and convert it from RGB to CYMK, often with some slightly dubious results. The colours were often out, and often it was quite fuzzy. So when I set about on my next big project, I thought, well, I'm going to have to change everything because I need to satisfy the printing process. So I decided to find myself a program where I could draw in CYMK, and I settled on something called CorelDRAW. So that's what I have been using ever since. However, the whole bulk of the London Railway Atlas is still in Visio. I haven't really got the heart to try and redraw it from scratch. I guess I will do at some point, but it's a vast amount of work. And the last couple of editions, they seem to have got the colours okay, so I'm not in a massive rush to do that. So now that I've given you the background on why I had to switch to a different bit of software, I was approached by Ian Allen again. They said, would you like to do a different atlas, a different area, different map? I was like, okay. They said Birmingham would make sense, it's a second city, so I was like, okay. So this is, again, probably quite hard to see, but this is the end result. This is the overview of the entire Birmingham and West Midlands Railway Atlas. I used the same method, so it was lots of screenshots on Google Earth, all stitched into a single file, and then essentially traced over and dropping the page boundaries over the top. I'd never been to Birmingham. I'd been to a couple of football games there, but I hadn't properly been there. I had no knowledge of the city at all. Unlike London, where I'd kind of pretty much lived my entire life and knew everything very, very well, it was kind of quite nice being in uncharted territory and having to learn somewhere from scratch. So I had to logically decide where I was going to stretch to in terms of coverage. So you've got some of the lines that serve the suburbs of the area that naturally stop. So you've got Redditch here, Stratford-upon-Avon here. This is Leamington, Rugby, Coventry. So you've got the whole Trent Valley line here, Birmingham proper here, Wolverhampton here. One thing that, one area that I feel with hindsight I probably should have covered is Stafford, which would be here. So for the second edition, which they have said, can you please do, Stafford will be included. So if I zoom in a bit, hopefully you can see a bit better. This is some of the detail. The first big thing you'll notice is because there are no tube lines in Birmingham, I was able to use the colour schemes to denote the railway companies. So I've used the same principle for Liverpool and Manchester, but you've got red for London North Western, green for Great Western, purple for Midlands, and I used orange for Metro and blue for British Rail. So this is a bit of detail of the Birmingham Atlas, which came out in September 2016. So, finally, my current work, which is the Liverpool and Manchester Atlas. This is the cover. Quite proud of the cover because they're both my photos, which is quite nice. So I started off thinking, well, clearly it's going to cover Liverpool and Manchester, but where else should it cover? So they've both got the urban areas, they've both got cities and towns in the immediate area. So I had to start thinking, well, how far out should I go? Which area should I cover? So I thought, well, I'll probably go as far as Preston. I was born there, so why not? And then if I go to Preston, I might as well do Blackpool and Fleetwood. That's logical. And then there's like Colne, Blackburn, Burnley, Wigan, St Helens, Chester, Buxton. So before Oldham, yes, it's all there. Trust me. Well, it's getting there. So I ended up essentially talking myself into a bit of a beast, but it all kind of makes sense. So this is the big reveal, which again probably won't be hugely clear, but this shows the overall area of coverage. So right up, and I started up here January 2017, 2.5 years ago. You've got Fleetwood, Blackpool, Preston, Blackburn, Burnley, Colne, Rochdale, Manchester obviously, Wigan, Liverpool, Birkenhead, and so forth. So you can see my method is I start top left and I work down. So I started in the far northwest and I just scan across. So I'm now currently finally on Liverpool after 2.5 years. You'll see there's some big dark grey blocks. That's just areas with no railways at all. So clearly I wouldn't map them. And there's a few paler grey blocks. These are just areas with no railways that I've basically set aside to put in large-scale maps. I'm trying to keep it as logical as I possibly can. So these large-scale maps will be of an area quite close. So this is Preston, that's going to be Preston, and so forth. So you don't have to flick too far backwards and forwards to find the large-scale map that is referred. So if I zoom in a bit, again, I know, not the sharpest, but just to, and I know it's not very glamorous either, but this is the area southeast of Wigan. So I'd heard of the Lancashire coalfield before, but I didn't really understand just how much railway there was going to be there. There are just literally hundreds of coal mines, each with their own railway systems, some with narrow gauge systems, some separate tramways. It's just an absolutely gargantuan piece of work. I'm spending months on just single pages. I wish I'd have known before I started, but then I probably wouldn't have started. So this is the kind of level of complexity and detail that I'm dealing with. So this is a bit of a money shot. This is central Manchester, which I finished a couple of months ago. You'll notice all of this orange stuff. These are the trams. So I've never mapped the trams before. I haven't done them for London. I didn't do them for Birmingham. Obviously, there are current modern tram systems, but I didn't do anything from history. But especially in Manchester, most of the tram system is built on former heavy rail lines. So it didn't make any sense not to map them. And then I ended up mapping, as you would expect, the tram system in Blackpool, which runs between Blackpool and Fleetwood, completely off-road. It's got its own separate tracks. If you were to look at it, it'd look like a railway. So it didn't make any sense not to map them. And I thought, if I'm going to do Manchester Metrolink and the Blackpool trams, I really do need to do all of the historic trams. not really realising that you could actually at one point catch a tram, in theory, all the way from back up in the high Pennines all the way to Liverpool. It was an absolutely enormous system. Every single town in the entire region has got its own tram system or had its own tram system. Many were interlinked. You had almost intercity tram services. So it wasn't bad enough that I picked a huge area to map. I've made this massive rod for my own back. Finding the dates for tram opening and closing has been quite difficult. So it's nowhere near as having the same trusty set of reference sources which I have had for the railways. So there will be a few question marks in there, but hopefully some tram experts will write in after it comes out and fill in some of the blanks. That's what I hope. And finally, this is the page I'm currently on. So this is like downtown Liverpool, just to illustrate when you zoom in just how much detail we've got going on with the tram lines. And this is the Liverpool Overhead Railway. I haven't named the stations yet. The 3 terminus stations, now just 1. So this is the kind of level of detail that I'm working at. And as I've already said, it's over twice the size of the London Railway Atlas, just in terms of the basic map pages. There's going to be all manner of large-scale maps at the back, I'm sure. So I'm sure it's going to be at least 200 pages of maps and then a huge index. So I had originally hoped this would be out for Christmas 2019. I'm not so sure now. I would need to have this finished by September. It's not going to happen. So I will, with my tail between my legs, write to the publisher and say, sorry, I think it's going to be 2020. So much like Crossrail, it's being gradually pushed back. So obviously what I don't want to do is sell myself short and not, I like to think I've got high standards when it comes to my maps, and I want to try and maintain those high standards. Oh. And if I don't, just blame the dog. Here she is hard at work. So I've got no idea if that was anywhere near an hour, but that's pretty much my presentation. So thank you very much.